Generally, when I'm moving through the forest, I'm drawn to relationships between trees or entire stands of trees and looking at the way in which they're interconnected. For this project, the Middle Fork project, I decided I wanted to draw in and study just a single tree. And for that tree, I chose a roughly 150-year-old hemlock. I chose it both for its shape and for its scale, but also because it's so ubiquitous in the Northwest forests. Making a plaster cast of an entire 140-foot tree certainly isn't a practical decision, but in this case it was a very rewarding experience. After protecting the tree, my team and I were up in the tree for nearly 2 weeks, and over that period of time, we were afforded a kind of an intimacy with the tree, where we learned all of these nuances that we certainly might not have come across by just passing by. We were able to see the way in which limbs might turn in a direction that you wouldn't have expected, the way they would fan out as a kind of patterned group toward light in the canopy. We would see a wound on the surface of the bark, and ultimately, each of these little things that we noticed in the tree created a kind of a cumulative story that we were able to understand about the tree as it was reflected in its environment. A big priority for the project was to directly involve as many people as we could in the actual creation of the sculpture. We began in MadArt Studios, which has a glass storefront open to public sidewalks, and we opened the doors and put a small sign saying people were welcome to come in and join us. Hundreds of people took us up on this. Some people came in maybe just for a few hours and contributed, while other people came back as often as a couple times a week throughout the course of the year. We also set up pop-up workshops in unexpected places so that we would find people who might be interested in volunteering right on the spot. We did this at the Seattle Art Museum's Olympic Sculpture Park Pavilion, and we also took another tact where we pre-arranged a visit that we'd set up. One instance of this was at the Weyerhaeuser headquarters in downtown Seattle, where we worked on a series of limbs with almost 100 of their employees over several days. The wood we used to create the sculpture is western red cedar, and it was salvaged from both an old downed tree as well as some large logs that had once buttressed an 80-year-old bridge. The team in my studio served as guides during the process, but ultimately each person that was participating would make their own choices according to how they wanted to build the sculpture against those molds. They were asked to maintain a certain fidelity to what that mold was, but they would choose the scale, they would shape the part, and they would bond the parts together in a way that made sense to them and in a way that somehow reflected what they found interesting. The work has continued in our main studio, where we've become involved in some of the larger choices in terms of how large sections of the trunk engage one another, and maybe most importantly, the way in which we've gapped certain sections. And I think that the gaps between sections of the trunk and the limbs offer compelling views into the interior shapes that we might not otherwise get to see. Refining the sculpture was a very important part of the process. Sanding the surfaces had to be handled very delicately. We needed to balance a desire for a certain uniformity or continuity over the surface so that we could see larger patterns, with a probably more important desire, which was to preserve the voices of the different people that had contributed. So each little irregularity of the surface needed to be maintained as much as we possibly could. I like to think of the sculpture as a sort of skin that's been shed by the tree, and that its thickness is roughly commensurate with how long it would take the tree to grow the same thickness as the sculpture. So in a way, what we're talking about is something that's a sort of ode to those 2 years in the life of the tree. Each time we've exhibited the sculpture, it's grown to fit the venue. So at the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery, the sculpture filled the full 50-foot length, and the limbs stretched up to the ceiling, out to the walls, and down to the floor. When the sculpture was exhibited in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum, the sculpture was 10 feet longer than it had been before. And in this instance, participants in the Economic Forum actually engaged in working on the sculpture while it was exhibited. It took our team in 2 sets of 5 people almost 3 weeks to install the sculpture in the Seattle Art Museum's Brotman Forum. The sculpture's reach just beyond 100 feet, and it's my hope that the sculpture will continue to be exhibited after it's been at the museum for a couple of years, and that over the course of those exhibitions it will gradually grow to the full length of the cast tree at 140 feet. When the series of exhibitions is complete, we'll take the sculpture back out to the forest and lay it at the foot of the tree that it was inspired by, so that it can gradually moss over and disintegrate into the ground. For me, this is probably the most compelling part of the whole project, because we see all of this collective work and energy as it collapses and disintegrates. But what it also affords us is this window into change, into the unanticipated, into something that we might never have expected.